Well, hi there, my name's James Hurman, and for the last year I've been working with Cannes Lions, WARC and Peter Field on a major new study of marketing effectiveness. Today's a really exciting day because we're sharing the outcomes of that study for the very first time.
This is Lions Live.
Over the last year, we've analysed and compared nearly 5,000 effectiveness case studies from the past decade from almost every country in the world. These cases were drawn from the Creative Effectiveness Lions, the WARC Effectiveness Database and the IPA Data Bank. So this represents one of the largest ever studies of marketing effectiveness. And the real question that we were asking was, how could we, as a marketing and advertising community, become more consistently successful at developing highly effective creative marketing? And as you can imagine, we found a lot, far too much to talk about in one session. So today we're aiming to give you a very top-line overview of the findings and then invite you to download the full white paper, which will allow you to really dig into the aspects of the study that interest you the most. What we're going to tell you about today is firstly a new framework and language of effectiveness that we've developed to help the industry to better benchmark effectiveness and to identify and learn from the most effective work in the world. Then in the second part of the presentation, we'll reveal an important new principle of effectiveness that our analysis has uncovered, one that's going to really challenge the direction that the industry's been going in, and which will hopefully give us a platform for positive change and more effective creative marketing. But more on that later. Where I want to start today is with an insight that came out of conversations that we had with dozens of client and agency leaders late last year. What those leaders told us was that although we prize effectiveness, we don't have what could be called a universal definition of what effectiveness actually is. When people use the word effective, they can mean many different things. They might mean that a brand has succeeded in generating a lot of attention or cultural relevance. They might mean that a product has been bought a lot more by a particular consumer group. They might mean that the client's bottom line has grown or that the return on investment of their campaign was very high. Because these different definitions exist, we're never quite sure of exactly what others mean when they say something's been effective. This lack of a kind of shared language of effectiveness has made it more difficult than it should be to identify and learn from the best work to become more effective in future. In response to this, we began to think about whether we could create such a language, whether we could help define effectiveness in a way that made it easier to benchmark and learn and improve. Along the way, we took inspiration from a couple of fantastic frameworks that provided an answer to a similar problem of how to define and describe creativity. Leo Burnett's 7+ scale and Heineken's Creative Ladder have given their respective companies a powerful way to evaluate and talk about creativity. They both codify different types of creativity and then set them in a hierarchy from least to most valuable from a creative excellence point of view. And they've both led those companies to significant improvements in the creativity of their work. Looking at these frameworks, it felt inevitable that we could develop a similar kind of scale and language for effectiveness. And so we started to think about what the different levels might be on an effectiveness ladder. When we think about how campaigns work and how effectiveness cases are presented, they usually start with campaign level metrics. Did lots of people see the campaign? Did they like it? Did they share it? Did they take the right message away from it? Then they'll show how that affected people's behavior and how they felt about the brand. And then they'll show how that created a sales gain for the business, which is usually the most important objective from the client's point of view. So that gave us a good place to start. We then looked really deeply into the different metrics reported across our thousands of effectiveness cases and how they contribute to the sustained commercial performance of a brand. And we used that analysis to build the framework that we've called the Creative Effectiveness Ladder. The ladder identifies the 6 main types of effects that creative marketing produces, setting them in a hierarchy of levels from least to most commercially impactful. The ladder begins with what we've called influential idea. These are campaigns that use creativity to maximize engagement and sharing, resulting in the campaign overachieving on campaign metrics and media efficiency. Level 2 is behavior breakthrough, campaigns that use creativity to change the purchase behavior of customers or to change other forms of behavior relevant to the success of the brand. Level 3 is sales spike, campaigns that use creativity to create short-term temporary growth in sales, market share, or profitability for a brand. Level 4 is brand builder, campaigns that use creativity to improve the fundamental measures of brand health, including awareness, consideration, preference, purchase intent, and image attribute ownership. Level 5 is commercial triumph, campaigns that use creativity to profitably increase sales and market share beyond a single quarter or beyond the duration of the campaign. And at the top, we have enduring icon, campaigns that use creativity to drive brand and sales growth consistently over a long period of 3 years or more. They stick with the same creative strategy or creative work throughout that period, creating sustained commercial outcomes. Now, campaigns at any level of the ladder are effective in at least one sense and valuable in some way to the client's brand, but the commercial value of the effects increases at each level. Campaigns can, and usually will, be able to show effects at least 2 levels of the ladder. Some will be able to show effects at every level. The levels are not mutually exclusive, rather the overall achievement of a campaign is indicated by the uppermost level that the campaign can prove results at. Now, what you'll find in the white paper is a deeper dive into each of these levels. What we'll show you is the types of metrics that we can use to prove effectiveness at each level, which media channels are most effective, and most importantly, the winning behaviors that are consistent across campaigns that have been highly effective at each level. You'll be able to download a how-to guide for each of the levels and dig into dozens of case studies that are examples of genuine best practice at each level and learn how and why they've worked. The reason we've developed the framework is ultimately to enable the marketing and advertising community to more easily identify and learn from creative effectiveness best practice so that they can more consistently produce highly effective creative campaigns and initiatives. And we envisage the latter being used in 3 key ways. Firstly, as a way of more easily identifying the very best creative work at each level and discovering how to drive specific types of important marketing outcomes. You can see how we've begun this journey in the white paper. Secondly, we see the latter as a powerful continuous improvement tool for agencies and client marketers. What Leo Burnett and Heineken have shown with their respective creativity frameworks is that they can be highly effective as continuous improvement tools. And we'd love to see the creative effectiveness ladder used in the same way to assess where we are now and to understand how to get higher up the ladder more regularly. Lastly, the ladder will be the new way that the Cannes Creative Effectiveness Lions will be judged. It'll be used as a scoring criteria and enable a less subjective and more rigorous assessment of entries. And future winners will be incorporated into ongoing analyses and guides for how to drive effectiveness harder and climb up the ladder. So I'd encourage you to check out the website and download the white paper, and I hope this new framework and the learnings that it's already revealing can help you better achieve the objectives that you have as a brand or agency. Now, while we were digging into the data to better understand what drove those upper ladder levels of effectiveness, we came across a really intriguing pattern. And it's a pattern that we believe has significant implications for how marketers and agencies manage and optimize the effectiveness of their work. It's also one that suggests that current trends in the industry are leading us in the opposite direction of effectiveness. What we found early on was that there are 3 campaign variables that align fairly consistently with effectiveness. These are media spend, campaign duration, and number of media channels used. As any of these variables increase, campaigns become more likely to achieve those upper ladder levels of effectiveness. These 3 variables are all dimensions of something that we're calling creative commitment, the amount of time, money, or media channels that have been committed to a creative idea. All campaigns have a profile across those 3 variables, and any campaign can be given a creative commitment score according to that profile. And we can then look at how those creative commitment scores correlate with effectiveness. Now, what we found when we ran the analysis on creative effectiveness Lions winners is that there is a very strong correlation between creative commitment and effectiveness. As creative commitment increases, so does effectiveness. Now, the reason that this excited us is that it gives us a way to predict the effectiveness potential of a campaign while we're still in the planning stages. and it gives us a way to maximize the effectiveness potential by maximizing the campaign's creative commitment. But before we got ahead of ourselves, we were wary that we were looking at a relatively small group of just 120 Creative Effectiveness Lions winners. So we went to the much larger WARC database of effectiveness case studies, over 3,600 from the same period of the last decade. And when we ran that analysis, we found the same relationship between creative commitment and effectiveness. Again, we can see that as creative commitment increases, so does effectiveness. What we were also able to do with this much larger, bigger number of case studies was ask the important question of whether it's all just down to spend. If the outtake is simply that when we have a bigger budget, we generate bigger results, well, that wouldn't be a particularly helpful finding. So we separated out the campaigns by their budget level and found that at any budget level, effectiveness increases as the other two variables of creative commitment increase. What this means is that even when we're stuck with a low budget, we still have two levers we can pull to increase our creative commitment and in turn our effectiveness. Again, this finding excited us because it gives us a very simple rule that allows us to evaluate the effectiveness potential of campaigns in advance of running them. And in the white paper, you'll find a way to use creative commitment as a planning tool and to assess how your campaign stacks up against others and what you can do to improve its effectiveness chances. Now, no effectiveness study would be complete without a Peter Field analysis of the IPA databank, and so I'm going to hand over now to Peter to tell you about what the IPA numbers have to say on the topic of creative commitment.
Well, the IPA data has quite a lot to say about creative commitment and why it's such a great metric. Firstly, it shows precisely the same pattern of rising effectiveness as creative commitment grows. Effectiveness in the IPA data, of course, measured as the number of hard business effects that were reported by those different campaigns. It's a really robust and strong metric. But this shouldn't be any great surprise to us because the data has shown many times over the years that each of the three ingredients of creative commitment, that is to say the duration of the campaign, the spread of media involved with that campaign, and of course the amount of money put behind it, are all in their own right drivers of effectiveness. And the reason they all contribute to effectiveness is that they are all related to the mental availability that the campaign creates. Mental availability being the extent to which the brand comes readily to mind in purchase situations. And the Ehrenberg Bass Institute has taught us over many years that mental availability is a vital prerequisite for growth. If we're not building mental availability, we will not drive long-term growth. The IPA data also teaches us something else about creative commitment, which is its main way of working, which is through penetration growth. That is to say, the extent to which we are able to attract new customers to our brands. And again, the Ehrenberg Bass Institute has taught us that without penetration growth, without bringing new customers into a brand will not grow in the long term. So again, it's a vital strength of creative commitment. With penetration growth, of course, comes market share growth, which again shows the same very strong rising trend as creative commitment is increased. And you don't need to be an accountant to appreciate that with growing market share, you're probably going to see growing profitability. And again, the IPA data shows that, although in this time round, the relationship is slightly more nuanced. What we see is a slight tailing off at the very highest levels of creative commitment as the extra cost of achieving that extra commitment, the extra budget, the extra media used, starts to bring about diminishing returns in the profit growth of the campaign. This shows us a very, very important issue that I'm going to come back to later in this video, which is the tension between effectiveness and efficiency, between maxing out the amount of growth we drive and doing it with the fewest dollars or euros that we can. And that's a very, very important issue, as we will see.
The next question that we asked was whether creativity matters when it comes to creative commitment. Is creative commitment made even more effective with creativity itself? As Peter showed us way back in 2010, creatively awarded work is significantly more effective than non-awarded work. And again, what we found was that at almost every degree of creative commitment, creatively awarded campaigns were much more effective. Now, what this tells us is that our very best chance of being highly effective comes from choosing a very creative idea, then giving it as much media spend, duration and market, and different media channels as we possibly can. And if anyone out there is thinking that that's obvious, the next chart I'm going to show you suggests that it can't possibly be. When we look at creative commitment over the last decade, we can see a rapid decline. We are spending less on campaigns, running them for shorter durations, and making use of fewer media. Now, every way we cut the data, it shows that effectiveness increases as creative commitment increases. And yet, year by year, our marketing and advertising community is decreasing creative commitment. We are in no doubt that this will be reducing the effectiveness of campaigns, but more damagingly, it will be reducing the value of marketing. Now, I'm going to invite Peter back now to explain why this is happening.
Well, the reason why this has happened, I think, is very strongly connected with this tension between efficiency and effectiveness that I mentioned earlier. We saw how profit growth starts to tail off as our investment in creative commitment exceeds an optimum. And econometric modelling has taught us this over many years, that you need to find that optimum point. And of course, that can be a very sensible analysis where we take a long-term view. And indeed, many businesses have decided to pursue growth over profit. Many tech businesses have pursued this route, because if we take a long-term view, we will know, of course, that eventually growth will turn to profit. But of course, if we take a very short-term focus, as many businesses do these days, and particularly we focus on the kinds of short-term return on investment metrics that we get from so much market mix modelling these days, and indeed many data analytics approaches that are used, it all starts to become really much less sensible and much more dangerous. Because what we have to remember is that return on investment is a ratio. It's a ratio of what we get back in terms of profit growth to what we put in terms of investment. And there's two ways we can maximise that ratio. We can either grow the profit benefit we get, which is tough, or we can minimise the investment we make, which is a whole lot easier. So if you pursue short-term return on investment, very simply, you end up pursuing short-term spikes. You go for the spike model of thinking, and of course this has been happening on a huge scale globally. We settle for mediocre long-term growth because we can achieve it at minute cost, and that equals fantastic ROI. And we see this in the IPA data. We see that the maximum returns on investment are achieved by low creative commitment campaigns, particularly those that go for the spike route. We know that that's what's going on here, because if we look at the data even deeper and we look at the kinds of campaigns that generate the biggest short-term spikes, and that's what this second chart shows us, we find again that it is the low creative commitment ads that generate these biggest short-term spikes, even though, as we've already seen, they achieve much lower long-term growth. So there's this really dangerous trade-off between ROI and long-term success. And unfortunately, what we also see is the inevitable corollary of that, which is that the proportion of ads that win creative awards are increasingly slanted towards short-term, low creative commitment ads. Creativity is the single most important thing we can do to drive effectiveness. But when we go down the low creative commitment route, we are robbed of the greatest evidence that we can get of that power. And in fact, a lot of it is thrown away. So it's a really important and unfortunate development that I urge you to be aware of.
Our strong view is that in order to improve the reputation and value of marketing, we must work together to turn this around. And so on behalf of Cannes Lions and WARC, we are urging clients and agencies to work to increase the creative commitment of their campaigns to ensure that they're maximising the results they're generating for their brands. So just to sum up, in response to the lack of a universal definition and shared language of effectiveness, we've created a new framework, the Creative Effectiveness Ladder, to enable the marketing and advertising community to more easily identify and learn from effectiveness best practice so that we can more consistently produce highly effective creative campaigns and initiatives. During our analysis of nearly 5,000 effectiveness case studies from the past decade, we made a new discovery that marketing effectiveness is heavily influenced by a campaign's degree of what we are calling creative commitment. Marketers should be working to maximize the creative commitment of their campaigns if they want to maximize their effectiveness. However, over the past 5 years, the industry has increasingly reduced the creative commitment of its campaigns, and we urge that marketers and their agencies work to reverse this trend in the interests of improving both the effectiveness of their efforts and the overall value and reputation of marketing. We'd encourage you to download and explore the research and full white paper using the link below. Thank you.